Last time we spoke, Li Zicheng had enacted his 10-sided net plan and won a multitude of victories over the rebels. However, this plan proved to be a disaster overall and cost the Ming Dynasty more than it did any good. Now Li Zicheng had established himself as the de facto largest rebel leader amongst others, who would now hold entire armies at their command. The Ming Dynasty was rotting from within, and its actions to prevent the rot simply delayed or sometimes made it even worse. With the allocation of so many resources to the northwest and center of China to deal with the rebels, the Ming's northeastern frontier was weaker than ever. Seeing the absolute turmoil from within, the Ching soon realized they could allow the rebels to do much of the heavy lifting for them for now. But soon it would come time for the Ching to overthrow one of the greatest dynasties in history. This episode is the fall of the Ming Dynasty. Welcome to the Fall and Rise of China podcast, and I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, if you're still hungry after all that for more History of Asia content, why don't you check my personal channel out at the Pacific War Channel over at YouTube, where I cover the history of China and Japan going far back into the 19th century, covering extraordinary events like the Opium Wars and the Meiji Restoration. Give it a look, it'll mean a lot to me. As things only worsened within the Ming Dynasty, soon the Qing would make their move in one of the most decisive engagements fought between the two empires. Given the Ming's recent ability to withstand the Qing raids over the past few years, the Ming Court remained a bit more optimistic that the Northeast could hold out. Hong Chengchou continuously argued that they should remain defensive despite many in the Ming Court pushing for offensive operations. Despite this, the Qing were making massive efforts at digging trenches for the upcoming sieges. By some estimates, some trenches were 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide, dug in several rows. The siege efforts represented an evolution in Qing warfare. Many differing groups were being employed and specialization was being seen on the battlefield. For example, Koreans were manning many of the firearms and Mongols were using more of their mobile warfare. At Jinzhou, some Ming relief forces began to advance, and upon hearing the firing of their guns, the defenders burst out of the south gate. The Ming engaged the Qing, who had sent 7,000 cavalry to hit them. A fierce battle was fought, but the Qing were able to move their cannons and use them to devastate the Ming. The defenders were badly hurt, having 738 dead and 793 wounded, but eventually the Qing turned away by nightfall. Despite this being a slight victory for the Ming, they had only months' worth of supplies left, and they were being advised by Zhu Dashou not to enter any battles lightly. But the Ming Court kept demanding more and more offensive operations, pushing Hong Chengchou to go forth with a force of 60,000 in July of 1641 to hit the Qing. The Qing forces were around Mount Rufeng, due south of Jinzhou. When Dorguan heard the report of 60,000 Ming incoming, he urgently sent a message to Huang for aid. Huang told Dorguan to stand firm, and he sent him 3,000 cavalry immediately to help him out. Estimates vary, but it's possible that Qing had up to 100,000 men in many elevated positions amongst all the siege works. When Huang arrived to the scene, he stated, "They say Hong Chengchou knows how to use troops. I can see that those aren't empty claims. My generals should be concerned." Some of Hong's commanders advised a retreat, stating their supply was short, but Hong said to them, Now today, we have this opportunity, and although our food supplies are growing short, you should listen to the order of your officers. If you defend, you may die, but if you don't fight, then you'll still die. But only in battle do you have any hope of favorable outcome. Thus, Hong led the attack personally against Huang's forces. Sorry if it gets a bit confusing with the Huang and Hong situation, by the way. Hong's left and right flanks advanced haphazardly and were quickly routed by the Ching. The next day, the Ming left flank panicked and fled, trampling into another and abandoning many weapons and supplies while falling victim to more Ching ambushes along the way. Over 50,000 Ming troops were lost, literally being driven right into the sea. Of the left flank, it is said barely 200 men survived, being ambushed all the way back to Ningyuan. The left flank commander, Wang Pu, would be executed for his terrible conduct. Hong Chengchou and the right flank made a fighting retreat all the way to Songshen with only 10,000 troops. Hong vowed to hold Songshen to the death with his forces. But now Jinzhou was more isolated and thus in grave danger. As the Ming dug in further, Huang told his forces all they had to do was sever the Ming supply lines and defend the coast, because the Ming were short on food and would soon fall apart. Huang returned to Shenyang and left the siege in the hands of his commanders, Dodo, Ziarhalang, and Abatai. Upon hearing the news, Chong Jen ordered Hong to fight to the death if necessary to protect Songshan. As the siege continued, the defenders pleaded with the court to send supplies while they only had a single bowl of rice per day to survive on. Things did not fare any better for the besiegers, who were now very low on supplies themselves. It would actually be Songshan that turned itself over to the Ching before Jinzhou in March of 1642. At Jinzhou, the defenders eventually resorted to cannibalism, and this finally prompted Zhu Dashao to surrender the city to the Ching. Next, Tashen fell with 7,000 of its defenders being massacred. Xi'an fell afterwards peacefully. Many of the Ming commanders were brought to Shenyang. Eventually, Hong Chengchou, after refusing to eat for several days, agreed to defect to the Ching, becoming the newest and most prominent Ming to do so. Hong Chengchou joined the Yellow Banner, working under Prince Duergun. These victories, now called the Battle of Songjin, allowed the Ching to acquire a ton of war equipment. They got their hands on 3,683 cannons and 1,515 of various guns. Now it seemed, the Ching had the necessary technological tools capable of toppling the Ming Dynasty. Hong Chengchou, just before the fall of Songshan and Jinzhou, proposed opening up peace talks with the Ching. But knowing the emperor's temper, Hong sent 2 envoys secretly, and by the time they reached the Ching, Songshan and Jinzhou had already fallen. Nonetheless, the talks occurred, and the Ching, in a great position, demanded territorial concessions, 1 million taels of silver per year in tribute, and would pull their troops back as far as Ningyuan as a gesture of good faith. The two states would be made equals and exchange ministers to conclude agreements. All of this was relayed to Chong Jen, who assembled his court, who were deeply divided over the matter. On one hand, agreeing to this would finally stabilize the frontier and allow the Ming to devote all of their resources to deal with the pesky rebels. But, on the other hand, it was dangerous to publicly announce that the Ming Dynasty was now treating with the Ching. The court decided not to go through with it, and the envoys left Shenyang. Thus, from that point onwards, no real peace talks would occur again between the two dynasties. The Ching brushed this off, because now they understood how strong their position really was. The conquest of the Ming Dynasty was now a reality, if they so desired it. Huang held a conference with his advisors, who all came to the conclusion that a peasant rebellion within the Ming Dynasty could do much of the heavy lifting that they needed to overthrow it. Huang would continue his raids to plunder for more supplies and booty, of course, But now he ordered his men to not rape or plunder indiscriminately. In September of 1642, the Ching sent 50,000 troops hitting the Ming defenses all along the Great Wall area, winning a series of minor battles. Then they assaulted Dongchang, but were repulsed by its defenders led by Li Zicheng. Despite the minor setback, they would eventually capture Dongchang 3 months later. It turned out the defenses of places in Shandong were oriented towards the sea, and the defenders were equipped and trained to counterattacks from that direction. Thus, they were not prepared for cavalry attacks. The Qing then attacked Jining, where Prince Lu courageously led the defense, but the city soon fell, and Prince Lu committed suicide as a result. Ming Grand Secretary Zhou Yanru then told the emperor he would lead relief troops himself. He did, and they routed very quickly, and they were defeated, though he would send back reports to Beijing stating he had won a great victory. This was of course not true. It turns out also that Zhou had not actually been on the actual battlefield, but rather dining at banquets with his friends while simultaneously sending a stream of victory reports to the Ming Court. He was not alone in this. Many other Ming officials were lying or over-exaggerating their war efforts, not wanting to face the wrath of the emperor's temper. During the raids into Nanjili, Shandong, and Henan in 1642 to 1643, the Ming records estimated the Qing had attacked 3 superior prefectures, 18 regular prefectures, 67 counties, and 88 towns. They had captured almost 400,000 people, 321,000 livestock, 12,000 taels of gold, and 2.2 million taels of silver, a colossal sum. Alongside all of this, they of course got their hands on more and more firearms. Matters were even worse than the plundering, however. As the Qing raided more and more, starving refugees fled into Shandong and Liaodong, burdening local officials. Just about nothing the Ming did would hinder the Qing, until one thing put a dent in the Qing attacks. The great Khan Hong Taiji died in August of 1643. Historians think it was a stroke that killed the great ruler. Now on the rebel front, in October of 1642, the great city of Kaifeng in Henan, once a former capital of China, was completely destroyed by a man-made flood. The flood submerged the city, and it's estimated 80% of its population would die because of this. Over 370,000 people. This would be a setback, not only for the Ming, but also for Li Zicheng, who had hoped to use its capture as a springboard for his ultimate goal, a thrust at Beijing. After the capture of Luoyang, Li had grown more aware of the necessity for a strategic base of operations, so he could hit the capital. Kaifeng was not just a strategic place, it was also a symbolic one. As mentioned, it was a previous capital. Li Zicheng's forces had actually assaulted Kaifeng a few times between 1641 to 1642, but each time they were repulsed and decided to attack other cities and then just return. By mid-July of 1642, famine was spreading with Kaifeng, and Li's forces had returned to try again. They expanded defensive moats around the city to siege and wait them out. Then they got the bright idea of utilizing the Yellow River to flood out the defenders. On July the 29th, an impassioned Li Zicheng killed a subordinate who proposed the idea of using the river, as his efforts to do so had not yet worked. The moats had only filled up with about 5 inches of water. Then, on August the 10th, the defenders of the city burst out to try and make a decisive victory against the rebels. The battle was ferocious, and Li Zicheng fought in the very thick of it, pushing the defenders back into the city. Kaifeng's walls were beginning to crumble, food was scarce, and no relief armies were able to come to their aid. The usual reports of people resorting to cannibalism began. Thus things were quite dire. This got the defenders to think of any way they might escape this plight. One idea was to use the river. Water levels had arisen to around 4 feet deep, and heavy rains were adding to all of this. The defenders hoped that by diverting the river, it might provide them with fish and other food sources. The commander of Kaifeng, in desperation, sent 3,000 of his crack troops out in the middle of the night to cut the dikes. But his men were caught, and they had to turn back. Then, in the middle of the night on October the 7th, the defenders were awakened by a great roar, and the river suddenly came crashing right into the city. The rebels pulled back and watched the enormous power of the river doing all the work for them. Now, historians are not 100% sure if the rebels had ultimately cut down the dikes, or perhaps heavy rains simply collapsed them. But in any case, the river smashed through the Cow Gate in the north, sweeping everything before it rushed out the south gate. People desperately climbed towers to avoid the raging waters or made rafts. The commander of the city built some 20 boats to evacuate. Prince Zhou and other high officials, as most commoners, were forced to climb to tree branches and debris, praying for rescue. By dawn of October the 10th, the city was fully submerged. The rebels looted what was left of the city, but it was in such a sorry state, there was no point trying to occupy it as a base of operations anymore. Thus, a quite disappointed Li Zicheng turned further south. It was a catastrophe for the Ming. Kaifeng was a base of operations used to coordinate defensive efforts for all of Henan, and specifically to protect the southern approach to Beijing. Now, as Li Zicheng's forces moved south, also in August of 1642, Zhang Xianzhong was embarking on a new venture. His force had been camped in Lake Chao, not too far from Luzhou, where he began to recruit and train naval forces. Zhang planned to attack Nanjing via the Yangtze River. For Li Zicheng, he was turning his attentions towards Nanyang, where Sun Quanqing was leading the Ming troops. Li and Sun's forces clashed a few times, but Li was able to bait, ambush, and eventually force Sun's forces to retreat towards Shaanxi and the Tong Pass. This allowed Li to hit the last position of Ming strength left in Henan, Runing. Runing was defended by Commander Yang Wenyue with only 3,000 troops. Yang also happened to be an old rival of Li's who had fought him a few times outside Kaifeng. As soon as the rebels approached the city, the defenders began to break and flee. Apparently, the defenders threw corpses over their walls into the moat in desperation. When Li Zicheng entered the city, he faced the captured Yang, and he said to him, "Master is an important official of the dynasty who will not submit to us. But now that we've caught you, what is your wish?" Yang would reply, "I myself, without any soldiers, only want to kill you. So today I'll die at your hands. What else can I say?" And thus, Yang was then executed in front of the Sanyi temple. Li Zicheng followed this all up by taking Xianyang, De'an, and Chong Jen in early 1643. At Xianyang, Li took new steps to building up his new order. He took the residence of Prince Xiang and made the prince and his siblings earls. Prince Xiangyang was renamed Xianjing, and Li took the title Long Accumulated Worshipping Heaven Leading in Righteousness Generalissimo. And thank God he decided to shorten all that down to just Commander-in-Chief. His second-hand man, Lo Ruzai, took the title Generalissimo, whose virtue and awe pacifies the people on behalf of heaven. What is with these guys and these ridiculously long titles? At this point, Li Zicheng's force began taking all men they captured between the ages of 15 to 40 and enrolled them within the army, and soon they were a Goliath force of 600,000 men. A few months later, Li Zicheng adopted the title of Prince of Xinshun and began procedures for taking future cities. Now, if the defenders resisted for 1 day, 30% of them would be killed. If they resisted for 2 days, 70% of them would be killed. And after 3 days, well, they all die. When Chong Jen heard reports about this, he was utterly disgusted. Jiang Xianzhong also upped his ante by renaming and reclassifying captured towns and prefectures in central China, even when he did not hold them. To add to the Ming's misery, some of Zhou Lingyu's subordinates attempted a mutiny to take Nanjing, raising a ton of tension. Zhou was eventually able to quell the mutiny, but it distracted him and his forces from Jiang's operations. At the beginning of 1643, Jiang remained the only rebel leader not directly subordinate to Li Zicheng. Jiang knew the danger posed by this and started to consolidate and legitimize his own power lest he be swallowed up by Li. Thus, Jiang decided to attack Nanjing, and as we mentioned, he built some naval power in order to do so. In May, Jiang's forces moved into eastern Huguang, capturing several cities, and soon he renamed himself Prince of Jinzhou. Then Jiang targeted the capital of Huguang, Wuchang. Many of Wuchang's forces were former mutineers under Zhou Lingyu. The city's defenses did not fare too well, to say the least, and fell by July the 15th. Within the chaos of its capture, thousands were massacred by Jiang's men, and thousands more drowned in the local river. The Prince of Chu himself was drowned in a bamboo cage by Jiang's order. The river was allegedly so full of corpses that the fish were unfit for consumption for months after. Jiang took all the captured men between 15 and 20 and enrolled them as soldiers, and he killed the rest in a very grisly manner. He renamed the city Tianshoufu, meaning received from heaven, and it would be the capital of his new western kingdom. Jiang then elevated the late Prince Chu's younger brother to a position of nobility within his new order. Jiang went on to make all these proclamations and promises of restructuring so much, but he only really ended up occupying the city for barely a month before being chased off by Zhou Lingyu. As he withdrew, he torched the city. I guess, so long for that. When Li Zicheng got report of all these ongoings, he decided to place 1,000 taels of silver for Jiang's head, demonstrating the emerging rivalry to come. Jiang moved on to occupy Yezhou, then he used boats to strike at Changsha. Like the poor souls of Wuchang, the defenders of Changsha did not take notice of the incoming rebel force, and did not make any strong defensive points along the city's northern approach. When Jiang approached the city's gates, he demanded their surrender, and only a brief effort was made by the defenders to repel them. Knowing it was fruitless, the commander of Changsha asked if he could give his life in return to spare the rest of his people. Jiang accepted this. It is said the commander's eyes remained clear and bright, and he did not cry as he was cut to pieces. The Ming Court was feeling helpless towards the declining situation. Now both the frontier and interior were in utter chaos. Officials were being impeached left, right, and center, and some were being executed. More and more officials poured into the imperial palace as the emperor demanded ever more solutions. In the spring of 1643, Li Zicheng began to consolidate his movement by eliminating rival subordinates. The first to go was Ge Guoyan, after he secretly met with Luo Cai, which prompted suspicion from Li. Li invited Ge to a banquet, got him very drunk, and killed him, thus taking all of Ge's forces for his own. Subordinates Zhou Qingwang and He Yilong were dispersed in a similar fashion, and even Luo Cai would face elimination. It seems he had grown too popular, despite the fact, unlike Jiang, he never expanded his political goals and preferred the life of a wandering bandit. There is some evidence to suggest Li took out Luo because rumor had it that the Ming were trying to get Luo to kill Li, and then obviously defect afterwards. However, Luo did not fall for the banquet affair, but later would be killed by a death squad sent by Li, who caught Luo asleep with his forces in camp one day. Luo's forces would be taken by Li, who continued his purge, prompting some subordinates to defect to the Ming. The Great Purge did not go unnoticed, prompting Zhang to send Li gifts, probably hoping to get on his good side, but Li sent nothing back in return. Then in the autumn of 1643, the Ming made a large offensive against Li Zicheng. The emperor ordered Sun Quanting to conduct an operation in Henan towards the east to crush Li once and for all. The problem for a long time, though, was most military strength was in the northeast, thwarting off the Ching. But now it seemed the court decided to divert considerable resources from the northeast in the hopes of destroying Li Zicheng in Hunan. Sun Quanting was not loved by the local gentry in Shaanxi because he raised many taxes to pay for local defenses, despite them being very successful. These gentry thought if they allowed Sun to lead Ming armies away from his defensive positions, he would no longer bother them with all this taxation, so they supported his idea. Now Sun opposed going on the offensive for many reasons. First most, he thought his defensive plans were bearing fruit in Shaanxi. If Li's army swelled, their supply lines would become problematic, and in winter, on everyone's heels, Sun figured Li's army's morale would eventually break and they would have to go west, falling upon Sun's defenses. Sun was also concerned with supplying his force in the event of an offensive operation, as in the past this proved to be quite fatal. He advised waiting until the following spring, but was completely ignored as all the gentry were now pushing for an offensive operation. Sun eventually had to bow to the local gentry and the court pressures to lead an offensive, remarking this: "This is the path to ruin." Sun marched down the Yellow River Valley, gathering Ming remnant forces in Liaoyang. Sun then ordered Zhou Langyu to take a force and advance from Jiangxi and strike south upon Ruining, hoping they could perform a pincer attack. However, Zhou's force was still recovering from being smashed the year earlier, and he had to refuse this order, something increasingly being done by commanders in the field at this point. So Sun had to advance alone and managed to smash a rebel force at Yuzhou to the utter delight of the Ming Court. They were all jubilant, except for the Vice Minister of War, Zhang Fengyi, who reminded them the rebels might be feinting an illusion of weakness to lure Sun into a trap. While Sun soon won victories at Baofeng and Jia, pushing the rebels further towards Xiangcheng. Despite the victories, Sun was facing the very problems that he had foreseen. His troops were running low on supplies, and years upon years of scorched earth tactics had devastated the agriculture of Henan. Thus, Sun's troops were at the mercy of neighboring provinces for food supplies, but the officials in those regions were unable or unwilling to send provisions. At that point, Sun's two subordinate commanders argued if they should go back on the defensive or continue with the offensive operation. Sun had sent a spy within Li Zicheng's camp telling him that Li's force was on the ropes. Thus, Sun decided that they would continue. As November hit, things got really bad, supplies worsened, and Sun's troops began to raid local towns or ate their own horses. The rearguard of his army then got cut off by forces under Li, who spread rumors to them that Ming relief forces were not coming to their aid. This all panicked the men, and the rear began to rout. Upon seeing the chaos, Sun ordered a general retreat and told his subordinates, Gao Jie to protect the rear and for Bai Guangyun to lay ambushes to cover the retreat. Bai took his forces and simply bolted for the Tong Pass. Unfortunately, for his almost complete infantry force, do remember they began eating all their horses after all, well, Li's cavalry found them and smashed them to pieces. Sun's army was soon routing, losing 40,000 men and abandoning an incredible amount of weaponry to the rebels. Sun tried to make a stand at the Tong Pass, but his forces crumbled to the rebel army. Bai Guangyun not only got his force smashed, but he ended up defecting to Li and became a commander for him. Sun proceeded to retreat up the Wei River Valley, where he would fight a final battle at Weinan, and he would die alongside all of his men. Gao Jie took his remaining forces and fled north, leaving Beijing completely open to attack. All of this convinced Li that the time was ripe to declare his intent to overthrow the Ming Dynasty and formally establish his own regime, which would be at Xi'an. While all of that was going down, Zhou Liangyu was fighting Jiang Xianzhong forces further south. Although Zhou's men managed to recapture Xianyang and Nanyang, Jiang, as we had mentioned, had taken hold of Changsha, and he was now fortifying it. The fighting between Zhou and Jiang would continue, and before long, Jiang found himself setting up shop in Sichuan, where he established his great kingdom of the west. It was there I mentioned that he took Yang Siqiang's corpse and desecrated it. Back in Beijing, the court now made Yu Yingui supreme commander of Shaanxi, and Yu was very skeptical about any effort to turn the tide at this point. And I don't blame him. With Sun Changqing dead, Li Zicheng had several options laid bare to him. One of his subordinates advised him to take Hubei's capital next. Another said they should loop around Jinling to get supplies and then hit Beijing. Others suggested taking a position in Henan and capturing further cities to draw more troops, then go across Shaanxi to hit Beijing. In the end, Li liked the last option, which was advised by his subordinate, Ge Jinyan. Yet, before Li would set out to do all of this, he wanted to create his own administration in Xi'an. He also decided the attack on Beijing would be done from two directions. Li and his subordinate, Liu Zongming, would advance on Beijing from the northwest, first heading from Xi'an and seizing Ming garrisons along the way through Shaanxi and the Great Wall at the Juyong Pass. His other subordinate, Liu Fanglian, would advance from the south, crossing through Henan to hit Beijing. Xi'an was protected by some of the largest walls in all of China and would fall without a single fight, as one of its leading officials was working with the rebels. At Xi'an, Li made the Prince of Qin an administrator and renamed the city Chang'an, recalling its Tang Dynasty name. Li followed this up by adopting many Tang Dynasty names for office positions and cities to add legitimacy to his own name and his movement. Li also began wearing dragon robes and began to distribute wealth to the people. Li's armies fanned out and conquered numerous places, renaming them. One place they took was his hometown of Mizhi, which he renamed Tianbo, meaning protected by heaven. And then he began to construct a palace there. On New Year's Day of 1644, Li Zicheng declared his Shun Dynasty within the city of Xi'an, now called Chang'an. Li took the reign title Yongchang, meaning eternal prosperity. Li then attacked the last remaining Ming stronghold in Shaanxi, that of Yulin. The fighting was fierce, but Li's cannons broke down its walls. Next to fall was Ningxia and Qingyang, where Liu Zongming suffered an outstanding 30,000 casualties, but managed to take the city. Guyuan was handed over to Bao Guang'an without a fight, and soon the rebels were marching towards Gangshu. Meanwhile, Beijing was in full panic. Some even advised a retreat to the second capital of Nanjing. In response to Li's march, the court dispatched commanders to various routes going to the capital to hinder. Li Mingrui, the Haolin Academy lecturer, advised the emperor in front of the court that he should have a, quote, southern tour to Nanjing, whereupon by virtue of the monarch, leaving the capital, like a dragon rising, or a tiger leaping, the masses would spontaneously rise to quell the rebels. Emperor Chong Jen made no note of this at court, but in private told Li he agreed but feared what would befall the Ming subjects if they learnt the emperor was fleeing to Nanjing. They then secretly went over the logistics of how to get the emperor to Nanjing safely. Li suggested taking men from the 8 prefectures around the capital rather than from the northeast, which would look like they are abandoning territory to the Ching. In the midst of these plans, another advisor came forward, Grand Secretary Li Zicheng, who argued they should raise 1 million taels of silver to recruit and fund an army to take Shaanxi back. The emperor pressed him on this, and Li stated he would work with the scholar Xilong to gather supporters from all over the northwest. The emperor, in absolute desperation, liked this plan and gave the go, giving Li the double-edged sword of authority. It is claimed the force that was sent out was 100,000 strong. The problem was all of these men were, in the words of a modern scholar, dandies, spoiled rich kids, space fillers, and incompetents. Around half of the force deserted after marching only 30 miles and returned to Beijing. Before any serious fighting ever occurred, most of the force simply scattered. Just 3 days after the army left Beijing, the emperor asked his minister of war about Li's whereabouts, and the official had no idea, prompting Emperor Chong Jen to exclaim, "How can my minister of war not know this?" Well, by that point, the emperor sat down with an official to look at the numbers. The official told him the rebels claimed to have around 1 million men, but reassured him it was probably something like 100,000. Then he gave the emperor a sobering account that the Ming forces around Beijing were around 80,000 strong, but that only 30,000 of them could be somewhat trusted, and that of that 30,000, only 3,000 really trusted. It was at this point the emperor revisited the southern tour idea in private while putting on a face in public that he would never leave Beijing. News from the front indicated Shun forces had just captured Taiyuan and Datong, where they killed yet again another Ming prince. Then the Shun took Xianfu, whose defenders simply turned the city over, and the populace welcomed the Shun with cheers and burning incense. Then Chongping fell in March without much of a fight. When the emperor received news of Chongping's capture, he got up during a court meeting and simply walked out. It is alleged he paced around the forbidden city, screaming out, "My ministers have failed me! Failed me!" Li Zicheng sent envoys to Beijing asking for the city to be handed over without a fight, and he offered a deal with the emperor whereby he would be recognized as a prince and together they would face the Ching. This offer would mean that Li would be formally made a prince of Shun, and all of the territory in the northwest would be his. Second, the Shun would receive a tribute of 1 million taels of silver. Third, the Shun would not take orders from Emperor Chong Jen, but would help fight the Ching and assist in quelling other rebellions. Emperor Chong Jen did not accept this proposal. Instead, he ordered many of his children to flee south and issued a directive for all civil officials to kill themselves, since they had failed to save the dynasty. When the rebels began to attack the gates of Beijing, apparently the defenders all fired powder shots, as they had all reached a secret agreement with Li Zicheng. Li Zicheng made great efforts to break the will of the defenders of Beijing before his approach. On the afternoon of April the 24th, one of Emperor Chong Jen's eunuchs gave the orders to simply open the city gates. Li promised the people of Beijing amnesty to all those who surrendered peacefully. Emperor Chong Jen appointed Liu Wenbing in charge of rallying the populace to defend the city, to which Liu replied, "If your majesty cannot do it, then how can I?" The emperor then went to Qianqing Palace in the Forbidden City and told the empress, "All is lost. As you are the mother of all under heaven, you should die." To this the empress replied, "I have followed your highness for 18 years, and I will die without a word. Today we die together with the altars of state, and we will have no more regrets." Emperor Chong Jen ordered the royal family remaining in Beijing to commit suicide, and for the younger ones to try and escape. The empress and many other members were able to commit suicide, but Chong Jen's youngest daughter, Zhao Wang, he had to kill himself with a sword. It is alleged Chong Jen by this point was so utterly drunk he accidentally cut Zhao Wang's arm off in the process and left her to die in a pool of her own blood. It is also furthermore rumored she would survive the wound and would live out the rest of her life as a Buddhist nun. Chong Jen and his faithful eunuch servant, Wang Chengyin, went to the base of Coal Hill and hung themselves from a tree. The emperor left a suicide note, reading, in part, "My inadequate virtues and weak flesh have invited punishment from heaven. Now the treacherous rebels are invading the capital. My officials have caused all of this. I must die, but I am ashamed to face my ancestors. Therefore, I take off my crown and cover my face with my hair. Rebels! You can dismember my body, but do not harm the common people." As the emperor lay dead, several eunuchs of the Ming Court, alongside the Minister of War, Jiang Qinyan, welcomed Li Zicheng into the city. Li Zicheng initially prohibited his men from plundering Beijing, but it was not too long until the populace was subjected to rape and looting. After all, how could Li Zicheng stop his men from the ultimate prize that was Beijing? The Shun Dynasty was beginning to be established, but unfortunately for Li Zicheng, there was a looming and rather large problem at hand. That problem was in the form of the Qing Empire, whose entire army was now at the doorstep of the dead Ming Dynasty. Oh yes, Li Zicheng had a major problem. The Qing had bided their time waiting for the moment to strike, and it was coming any minute now. Li Zicheng's only hope to hold them off would be to try and rush to the northeast and win over as many of the Ming defenders in the area as possible and bolster them up for war. In May, Li Zicheng had set forth from Beijing to meet the enemy in the northeast, leaving his subordinate, Li Zicheng, in command of Beijing. Over in Shanhaiguan was the commander Wu Sangui, who was very unsure what to do. When the Ming commander learned that the forces of Li Zicheng had abused members of his family back home, he decided he was going to defect to the Ching. Well, Li Zicheng heard reports of Wu's resolve and begrudgingly sent a small force quickly to go attack Wu, who engaged that said force around Yongping. Wu smashed the force to pieces and he fled back to Shanhaiguan. Now enraged, Li and Liu went forth with an army of around 100,000 to crush Wu. Now, Wu realized the Qing military were most likely better off than the rebels, and after some lengthy negotiations with Prince Duerguan, Wu arranged to allow the Qing to enter China proper through Shanhaiguan, unmolested in exchange for their assistance in defeating the treacherous Li Zicheng. It seems Wu believed he might be able to score himself as the next ruler of the Ming state, or at least become a prince under the Qing. Prince Duerguan was quite suspicious of Wu, however. The offer suited the Qing, of course. It would allow them to look like they were avenging the Ming Dynasty against a bunch of rebels. Before Wu had come forward, Prince Duerguan had been planning on attacking Beijing by coming through Inner Mongolia, But now, the alliance solved that problem entirely. A Qing force of 140,000 men came to Shaohaiguan and joined forces with Wu. Darguan ordered Wu to take his army as a vanguard for their combined force. Now, Darguan's thinking was by doing so, Wu's men would take the brunt of the hard fighting, and this would ensure, after their victory, that his forces would not be strong enough to stand up to them if Wu had a change of heart. Li Zicheng had sent 100,000 men, but many of his commanders were recent turncoats, such as Tang Tong and Bai Guang'en. Also, for many of the rebels, the ultimate goal had been achieved. They looted Beijing. Many did not have it in mind to continue fighting. Li Zicheng's ultimate mistake, however, was not that he was engaging in combat with Wu or the Qing, but that it never occurred to him that they would be joining forces. In late May, the Wu-Qing alliance and Shun forces would do battle on the field just outside Shanhaiguan. Shanhaiguan had 3 outlying castles guarding the interior approach, and Wu had prepared his main defensive line on the west bank of Shihe. 40,000 Shun troops crashed into Wu's main defensive line, and Wu motioned his forces back into the main castle while simultaneously sending out 20,000 men to the north and to the west to cut off the Shun's escape routes. In the initial clash, the battle was fairly even, with both Wu and the Shun losing considerable amounts of men. Wu grew concerned that the Qing were merely going to allow his force to be smashed to pieces and then sweep in afterwards. And he had every right to think this. They most likely were going to do just that. Despite the terrible odds, Wu's force seemed to be turning the tide somewhat, and this prompted Prince Dargun to send 2 waves of 20,000 cavalry to envelop the Shun. The next day, Wu led a charge against the Shun formation, but they repulsed him right back into his castle pass. Then the Qing cavalry of the White Banner, led by Ajige and Dodo, smashed into the Shun. Wu's men saw the Shun morale crumble and charged upon them yet again, bursting out of the castle. Li Zicheng was directing the battle from a high tower position, and upon seeing the cavalry, he simply assumed them to be Wu's forces. Dust clouds made by the charging cavalry made it very hard to see what was going on, but as the battle heated up more, Li Zicheng began to see swarms of arrows raining down on his men, and he realized these were Manchu people, and he screamed out, "The Tartars have come!" The Shun forces collapsed. Many were driven towards the sea and drowned. The Shun force retreated and scattered, with many returning to Beijing. Li Zicheng and his men fled as fast as they could for Beijing, where they staged a very quick enthronement ceremony for Li, where he was declared as an emperor. Then Li had his army plunder Beijing, and most of the rebels left the city the day after, carrying off all of their loot. Prince Dargun, serving as regent for the child emperor of the Qing, Shunji, entered Beijing in May of 1644, seeing all the rebel armies flee before them. He quickly announced to the populace they were now under the Qing rule, as Li Zicheng fled west to Xi'an. Over the next 6 months, Li's authority would disintegrate throughout all the territories that he had conquered. Ming loyalists, some semi-independent warlords, and the Qing swallowed up everything in sight. Eventually, Li found himself in the summer of 1645 being pursued by the Qing prince Ajige to the vicinity of Mount Jiaogong. How Li Zicheng died is not exactly known. Some say he hung himself after being surrounded by some very angry and hungry peasants. Others say the peasants beat him to death looking for food. What is known is that his corpse was badly mutilated when it was found. Li Zicheng's body was sent south to Ming authorities who decapitated it. Our old friend, Zhang Xianzhong, was in Sichuan and would hold out until 1647. We will talk more about him much later. Ming loyalists in the south would hold out on the mainland until 1662, and ironically, many of Jiang Xianzhong's subordinates would be their commanders. Some Ming loyalists famously would hold out in Taiwan until 1683, still trying to reclaim the dragon throne for the Ming. History marks the fall of the Ming Dynasty to be 1644 with the death of Emperor Chong Jen. Many historians argue various reasons for why the Ming Dynasty ultimately fell. One historian stated this: "The Ming could no longer manage its resources, utilize its strength, and maintain its focus." And indeed, the Ming Dynasty fell as a result of gradual political, strategic, and tactical errors that simply grew so large they could not be overcome. Given proper leadership, delegation of authority, and allocation of resources, the Ming Dynasty most likely could have survived. The fall of the Ming Dynasty has captivated people for centuries, for it was one of the wealthiest, most powerful, and prosperous empires in the world. Yet, it fell to peasant rebels and some unified tribal peoples of the steppe. How? As is seen with most of China's history, the fall of the Ming Dynasty is seen in terms of a dynastic cycle, whereby a dynasty eventually becomes so corrupt it simply collapses upon itself, and another more diligent government comes and takes over. It is, of course, not so simple, as many of you probably already know. There are various reasons for its downfall. Take, for example, the unbelievable factionalism of the Ming bureaucracy, which in turn politicized just about every aspect of their government. By the end of its rule, it certainly seemed the politics were trumping the military when it came to defending themselves. Then these problems were only made worse when more and more competent officials were jailed or executed, and more incompetent officials were the only ones left to fill the roles. The last emperor, Chong Jen, certainly did not make things any easier, such as when he forced Sun Chuangting to go out into the field against Li Zicheng. Also, the issue of climate is a striking one. During the 17th century, the world was witnessing what is called the last of the Little Ice Ages. The era was marked by less solar activity and tons of volcanic eruptions that shot up into the atmosphere, darkening the skies. The global temperatures got cooler by about 1 to 2 degrees, right around 1640, in the midst of many violent upheavals. Hell, remember that story about the island of Jiaohua being attacked because the waters had frozen, allowing Nurhachi's men to cross them? It was much to the shock of the defenders, and for a very good reason. Sometimes climate can have an incredible effect on such events. The amount of natural disasters and droughts which led to wide-scale famines had an enormous effect on producing the sort of situation that allowed such a large rebellion to take place. Personally, having studied quite a bit about the Taiping Rebellion that will occur in the 19th century, it's all quite fascinatingly similar. And trust me, the fall of the Ming Dynasty is quite foreshadowing. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. So please, go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, if after all this, you are still hungry for some more History of Asia content, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel over at YouTube, where I have episodes talking about the history of China and Japan during the 1800s, like the Opium Wars or the Meiji Restoration, all the way to the end of the Pacific War in 1945. Give it a look, it'll mean a lot to me. So at long last, the Ming Dynasty has fallen, and now we have the Ching Dynasty taking its seat upon the Dragon Throne. I thought it to be very important to explain how the Ming fell, because in many ways it will mirror how the next dynasty will fall as well. Stating that, the Qing dynasty certainly took note of what befell the Ming, and made their primary endeavor to root out corruption. But, ironically, it would be just that which would destroy them as well.